if you're a business owner, whether you have been a solo entrepreneur, somebody who started his or her own business, their own practice, and effectively have found themselves working in the business all the time, becoming the single point of failure as well as the single point of success for that business, then there's a good chance that you find yourself caught in what is commonly called the owner's trap, where you thought you were starting a business, but actually what you've done is you've started something that owns you just as much as you own it. Effectively, nothing happens unless you do it. Now, there's only really one way out of the owner's trap, and that is to build capacity into your business through people. And the instinct, well, to start with, is not to do that, because the fear factor of being responsible for somebody else's livelihood can be really quite overwhelming when you first consider it. Once you get past that, then the instinct is simply to just get on with it and hire. That can be problematic, because whilst people can give you capacity to facilitate the growth that you want to achieve and to achieve some kind of work-life balance, or at least a work-life blend that's healthy, and to get yourself out of the owner's trap, so you start managing people to get things done rather than simply having to do all the time yourself. You typically, because you've never done it before, will find yourself hiring somebody who's got great experience, looks good on paper, they seem to interview okay, they seem to be a decent person. All the signs and triggers are there to say, this person ought to be able to do what I can do. So I'll hire them, I'll put them on the payroll, and then when they turn up, there can be variable levels of success with that. Because often the person you thought you were hiring is not actually the person that ends up on the payroll. Now, sometimes that's down to the fact that you haven't been as clear as you could be about the job itself. In fact, what you'll find is that very often, if you simply hire quickly because you have a desperate need to fulfill an immediate shortfall in capacity, then there's a very good chance that you haven't built out the processes and the procedures and the ways of articulating what needs to be done and the way in which it needs to be done, which make delegation not just possible but effective. Most businesses don't get this right to start with, so if you happen to find this is resonating with you, don't feel bad about it, you're perfectly normal. The rule here really is to set the processes up first, so you've got a very clear understanding of what you're going to be delegating and how you're going to be delegating it, because that will then also inform to some extent your job description and give absolute clarity to what success looks like, but also importantly what failure looks like, because you can't really blame anybody, a new hire or anybody else, for not doing something that they were supposed to do when you didn't clearly tell them what that was, or actually for doing something that you didn't want them to do when you didn't clearly tell them not to do that. Now that might sound pretty basic, but again, most businesses get it wrong. Even some quite big businesses, by the way, continue to get it wrong over a long period of time. The failure rate for new hires is staggeringly high and staggeringly expensive, because it's not only the cost of the new hire's salary and any percentage of salary that you might give to a recruitment agency or other external provider who helps you to acquire the new hire. It's also the opportunity cost of getting it wrong. You know, what impact has it had on morale for other team members? What impact has it had on your own management time when you could have been doing other things that are a significantly better use of your time and indeed a much more valuable use of your time? What impact has it had on, I suppose, just the clients, maybe even on client retention? The cost of a bad hire to a business is astronomical. There's data out there to say that on average as well, a bad hire isn't really identified until, as I say, on average, 10 months into their tenure, which is a very long time for somebody to sit on the payroll, taking a wage and not actually doing the things that he or she is meant to be doing, or at least not doing them as well as they're meant to be doing them. On average, that can cost around 4.5 times their salary, and that's assuming that they're a operational person, that they're not actually client facing. If they're client facing, particularly if they're in a sales role or a business development role where they're into client acquisition, then the cost to your business can be as much as 15 or even 20 times their salary, depending on the industry that you're in. This gets to be profoundly impactful in a very, very negative way. So spending some time to get your hiring right is probably the best investment of time you will ever make. So not only should you get the processes and procedures that underpin their role absolutely crystal clear before they start, and in fact even before you start the hiring process, but you should also make sure that your hiring process has several stages and goes through, really, I suppose the best way of thinking about it is filters, because you cannot ever prevent a bad hire. All you can ever do is mitigate the chance of getting one. And you do that by putting several stages into the hiring process. And if you think this is going to take a long time, just think how much more time it would take and how much cost there is involved if you get it wrong. Hire slowly, and then if you do get it wrong, if somebody bad does end up on your payroll, then it's the kindest thing to do to actually fire them reasonably quickly. Because when you identify somebody as a weed in your garden, you really need to help them to move on, because they might well be a flower in somebody else's. And your garden's going to grow an awful lot better when you pull a few weeds. So, what do those filters look like? Well, the first thing is, make sure that they actually give you a written cover letter with any resume or CV. If they cannot write a bespoke letter that is tailored to the position that you are recruiting for, they shouldn't even get past phase one, because chances are it's just a fairly generic thing for them. They're just firing out a bunch of applications because they want a new role. It's not that they specifically want your role, or even if they are sending out applications speculatively to a number of different companies, they should specifically want your role and be prepared to actually write to you to tell you why they particularly want your role. So that's the first thing. The second thing is to have a very quick telephone screening call on the basis of their CV or resume. And in that screening call, you're going to ask some basic questions that are, well, really, I suppose they're the absolute minimum viable qualities that you expect in this employee. The basic tickets to the game, the table stakes, if you will, for them to actually come on board, in terms of mindset and attitude, but also basic technical competencies that are essential for the role. And that probably only needs to take about 15 minutes, but you'd be surprised how many people you can rule out straight away based on those screening calls. Now, if you are using an external recruiter, then it's actually very often these screening calls that you're actually paying them for, because they can go through hundreds of resumes for you, CVs for you, and do those screening calls. And that's actually, to some extent, how they earn their money. You should be very cautious about any recruiters that simply just dump a load of CVs on you, because you can get that for yourself using an online jobs board or LinkedIn or something like that. And if you're going to do all of the hard work yourself, then why the heck are you paying a percentage of salary to a recruiter? There are some very good recruiters out there, so I'm not actually calling them out on that, but there are also some who bring that particular industry into disrepute, shall we say. After you've gone through the screening call, you create a long list and you bring them in for initial interview. That initial interview is typically going to be competency-based, which means it's around, can they do the job? And you're going to ask them questions that go beyond the simple surface things that are in the CV, and you I suppose, I don't want to use the word interrogate because that sounds a little bit harsh, but you're certainly going to question deeply as to whether or not they actually have the technical chops to do the things that they need to be able to do. And you're listening out for good quality answers, which typically form stories that will indicate real life examples of them being able to do the things that you need them to be able to do. For any of you who are novices out there on this, interview candidates, if they have been trained in how to be interviewed, will use very often an acronym STAR, S-T-A-R, which is situation, task, action and result. And they use that in order to be able to quickly and succinctly articulate a short story that gives you, as the interviewer, the evidence that you require. Listen out for that, because if they've had a lot of interview practice, that might be an indicator that they are a serial employee, that actually in the revolving door of talent acquisition, they're coming out of the door as often as they are going in through it. They get, maybe their CV is starting to look a little bit like the Yellow Pages because it's got so many jobs in it. I don't know. You don't really get the Yellow Pages anymore, do you? It's yell.com these days, but you take the point. If the CV is as thick as War and Peace, you know you have a problem because they've got a lot of jobs on there. Now, once you've gone through that basic technical competency interview, providing the interviewee has moved on to the next stage, it's at that point quite a good idea to do a couple of assessments. You might want to do a practical assessment for the role, if there are some specialist areas of expertise or capability that you expect them to be able to evidence, but also maybe some sort of psychometrics. Now, there's a whole bunch of different psychometrics out there, some of which are competency-based and some of which are personality-based. The personality-based ones have got varying levels of accuracy and, shall we say, scientific rigor underpinning them. Try to get something that is biased towards identifying the big 5 personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. Now, if you've got something that looks to those 5, the big 5 personality traits, that will give you a much better read on the person than, say, something which is using, I don't wish to overcomplicate this, but Jungian archetypes, which have got no real kind of scientific rigor underpinning them. However, even if you are using something that uses Jungian archetypes, something like Smart Insights or DISC or something like that, or Myers-Briggs, then provided you've got somebody who's good at interpreting these things, then, and you only use these assessments as a basis to start another conversation with the prospective candidate, then they're perfectly valid, they're perfectly useful, because all you're using them for is a basis for further conversation. And that's perfectly acceptable, as long as you know what you're doing with them. Once you've done those things and then you get into the next conversation, ideally you'd have a different interviewer, or you'd mix it up with some other second interviewer coming into the interview with you. And in this second interview, you're going to make it much more about them, their mindset, their character. You've already assessed whether or not they can do the job. So the basic functional tick boxes are there. You know, they have the experience, they've got the past results that say they're perfectly capable of doing this thing, and they have the technical skills, okay? But all of those things are lagging indicators of success. If you stop your hiring process at that point, once you've assessed that they can do the job, then you will regret it 9 times out of 10, because you haven't found out whether or not they're the sort of person that's going to fit with you, with any other team members that you might have, and whether or not they've got the sort of mindset that allows them to actually be a useful member of your team who is going to grow, become autonomous, and actually make your life easier, which is a pretty darned important aspect of what a good employee looks like. So this second interview has got to be around identifying A-player characteristics. And A-player characteristics are things like a growth mindset, coachability, the tendency to look for opportunities and solutions rather than simply problems, the ability to be quite resilient, to bounce back from failure quite quickly, and more importantly, to learn from failure. These are the sorts of things which will actually pay dividends to you in the long run. Because if you think about it, it's all of those kinds of negative personality traits that actually end up causing this person to be a bad hire. How many times, if you have hired before, how many times have you encountered people who can definitely do the job, but it turns out that they're just not a good fit and not a good team member because they don't ascribe to your values, they don't ascribe to your culture. In fact, they end up being a little bit toxic, and you end up sadly parting company with them because they're basically a negative force that's dragging you down. So avoiding that is absolutely critical. It's only then that you're going to get into the actual hiring process itself, and assuming you then get to a point of being able to offer them a role, you would then start your onboarding. Now, onboarding is something which most businesses get very badly wrong. And whilst almost all employment contracts or service contracts will have some kind of a probationary period baked into them, whether it's a 3-month period or a 6-month period or whatever, almost like we haven't really kind of settled on you just yet, we want you to prove that you have actually come on board and been a successful hire, that you are a good hire. Actually, most businesses, when that person hits the payroll, they sort of forget or just allow business as usual to kind of take over, which means that very often you get to the end of a probationary period and the hiring manager or the line manager is scratching his or her head and saying, well, I'm really not sure. I think I might need to extend the probation. Stop. If you have ever extended somebody's probation, there's something seriously wrong. If you cannot find out whether somebody's a good hire within 13 weeks, which is your 3-month period, 90 days, your onboarding is wrong. You've got it badly wrong and you need to address it. Every single week during that first 13 weeks should have a milestone that is clearly agreed between you and the new employee, and so both of you know what success looks like each week and what failure looks like each week. If by week 2 or week 3 every single box has been ticked and they're doing all the things they're supposed to be doing, you've already got a real positive vibe that actually this person is everything you expect them to be. If by week 3 or 4 or 5 they haven't hit all of their metrics, then yes, you can review and say, well, were all of those measurements and reasonable and everything else? But assuming they were, you're starting to get early indicators that this person is not the person you thought they were. And also, really importantly, because you're being so clear and upfront with them, they also know what the potential consequences are of not doing these things. And those consequences are likely to be career limiting. So if you do get to the point of having to terminate them as a result of failed probationary period, you have got a very clear record of everything that you have done during that onboarding process, during that 3-month probation period, and why, with absolute certainty, black and white certainty, they haven't made the grade. And it makes the conversation, whilst still very painful, a lot easier, because you can simply say to them, look, we're at the end of week 13, these are all the things we said that you were going to do, and we've reviewed them every single week, and not once have you actually achieved the things you were supposed to be achieving. What did we say was going to happen if that was the case? And the employee themselves will say to you, well, you were going to be giving me my marching orders. And it's regretful and it's unpleasant, and nobody in their right mind enjoys conversations like that, whichever side of the fence you're on. But it's a darn sight more compassionate to be that candid and that upfront. rather than any of these things coming as a surprise, as a bolt from the blue. So making sure that you have got that kind of an onboarding process is absolutely critical. Far too many businesses and business owners kind of take the same approach to onboarding as we all do when it comes to, I don't know, signing up for the latest TV streaming service, or some kind of online service like LinkedIn Recruiter or LinkedIn Sales Navigator or something like that. They give you like a month's trial, don't they? And you put your credit card details in, and the first time you actually think about the fact that you have this trial is the next month when your credit card gets charged, and you think, gosh, I never actually trialed it. And if that's the case, if you're taking that approach to your employees, then you are setting yourself, your business, and the employee up to fail in a really negative way. So hire slowly, fire quickly if you've got it wrong, but set yourself up for success by mitigating the chances of getting a bad hire. Happy recruiting.